Well, I think Chanel was very much a modern woman. The sort of demands she placed on clothes and the sort of solutions she came up with were things that were suggested to her by her life as a modern woman. They were really clothes for living in. They weren't clothes to be ostentatious displays of wealth. They were clothes for getting on with business.
It was Chanel who really did, as Mary Quant said, bring about a modern way of dressing.
Her whole philosophy was that things should be worn in a very casual, nonchalant way. She wanted women to feel comfortable but look elegant. Indisputably, of any 20th century designer, she had the most long-lasting influence, and she was the most original. Gabrielle Chanel was born in 1883 in Saumur in northern France. The thing about Gabrielle Coco was that she elaborated so much of her life and she obfuscated other bits, so it's hard to tell exactly what happened, but I think we're pretty clear that it was not an easy childhood.
When she was only 6, her mother died and her father placed her in an orphanage, a convent orphanage.
She lived there until she was 18, when she was too old to stay with them any longer, and then she was cast out on the streets. But it should be pointed out that while Chanel was at the orphanage, the nuns taught her how to sew, and that would prove pivotal.
So she left there and went to work as a seamstress. But at night, as a sort of sideline job, she was performing in cabaret. She was one of the poseurs.
She actually at one point wanted to be a performer because that was the route for a poor girl to actually make some money, but it wasn't very successful.
It was there in cabaret that she got her famous nickname. She'd been christened Gabrielle Bonheur, but she became Coco, and that may have been for a famous song that she used to sing, Cocorico, or it may have been short for cocotte, which of course means both flirt and, less kindly, kept woman. Because from this time on, the wealthy men around her would be a very important feature of Chanel's life. While she was working in cabaret, Coco Chanel met the textile heir, Etienne Bolsin, and it was he who first offered to back her in the millinery business.
She actually went to live with him in his chateau for a period of time. When she turned to millinery as relief from the kind of boredom she experienced when he would leave her to go on different military campaigns, but then she also spun that out into a business.
She then met a friend of his, an even richer friend, Arthur, or Boy as he's usually known, Chapelle, and who was an Anglo-French polo-playing rich man who volunteered to actually set her up with an establishment of her own.
Chanel was a very quick study, and he opened up even more of a sophisticated world to her, and she absorbed it all, and together they were quite the power couple.
To Boy's credit, it wasn't only financial backing he gave her. Some of the things he loved, his whiskey hip flask even, would influence the design of the first perfume bottle. And that whole sports-playing, gentlemanly look was very influential for Chanel's first designs.
I think it is important to state that Chanel was incredibly single-minded, she was incredibly willful, and she was very ambitious. For her, having sewing skills and seeing fashion as a career that women could succeed in without the interference of men, she saw that as kind of her ticket to freedom. With Capel's support, she launched her own business in Paris. She actually shared the shop with an existing couture establishment, so she wasn't selling clothes, she was only selling hats. But she sold hats to high-ranking members of French society, including a woman called Gabrielle Dauzenet, who wore a Chanel hat in a 1912 theatre production of Bellamy, and that garnered extreme attention for her across Paris.
She then opened her shops in Deauville and in Biarritz, the seaside resorts.
La mer qu'on voit danser le long des golfes clairs
It was here that Chanel moved into making clothes as well as hats.
Deauville proved to have a great influence on Chanel's early style because she incorporated sort of sailor stripes, famously the Breton T-shirt that just, well, it was initially a signature piece for Chanel, but it's become a classic throughout the world. She also took the fisherman's jersey, which had been considered a very poor sort of functional cloth before, and she made dresses out of it, slouchy jackets.
She once said that it started when, because Deauville is a little chilly, she pulled on an old jersey shirt and realised its possibilities.
At that time, jersey was perceived as a fabric that was used only for men's underwear, but Chanel felt that it could be applied to women's dress, and specifically that it could be applied to kind of modernising women's dress. It sounds incredibly simple, but really it was revolutionary because not only was it about clothes that were free, clothes that were easy to wear, clothes that weren't restrictive, it was also about taking something that was really everyday and elevating it to luxury.
Very, very quickly, she was able even to pay Boy back with the money that she was making from these new, utterly revolutionary designs.
Chanel actually established herself as a couturier in 1918. That was when she founded the house as Maison Chanel at 31 Rue Cambon. In subsequent years, she would take over the buildings on either side of that to expand her ever-growing empire.
And the salon there in Rue Cambon is still very much the way it was in her day, with its golden beige carpets and its mirrored staircase where Mademoiselle would sit sort of out of sight of the audience and watch the shows.
Really what Chanel's clothes epitomised after the First World War was a new way of dressing and a new kind of femininity. It wasn't about corsets, it wasn't about layers of clothing, it wasn't about kind of a cumbersome silhouette. It was about simplicity.
So there were all these movements happening in the start of the 20th century. You know, there was the start of abstract art, cubism. There was what Chanel was doing, and it all came together after the First World War because women just did not want to dress in the old way anymore.
That was something that had begun to emerge in women's clothing during the war, when women suddenly had to move much more and undertake different tasks than they'd ever had to do before. Women had to work. When women emerged from the war, they didn't want to give that up. And really what Chanel offered was a new wardrobe for a new type of woman. Today, it feels like a lot of the symbols of her look are really eternal. And it's really difficult, I think, to perceive how shocking they were at the time. The whole idea of wearing fake jewellery. Chanel wore ostentatious fake jewellery. It was really about inverting ideas of luxury, challenging notions of preciousness, things that have been kind of cemented since the Middle Ages. Chanel was ripping them apart and was proposing something modern alternatives, modern views of luxury. And it was all tied up with ideas of practicality, ideas of freedom. Chanel said, if there's a button, there must be a buttonhole that goes with it. If there's a pocket, you should be able to put your hand in it.
When Chanel was fitting designs onto her models, she used to make them bend over, stand up, sit down, get up as if they were getting up the steps of a bus, just to be sure that the designs actually worked for everyday living. And I think that's why women absolutely fell on them. She herself said that what she wanted was to make designs where a woman could breathe, eat, drink without actually fainting.
Chanel met the Duke of Westminster aboard his yacht in Monte Carlo in 1923, and the two started a decade-long relationship.
Once again, one of her lovers gave Chanel something important for her aesthetic, these wonderful British tweeds and the colours that came with them. And of course, tweeds in all their variety of colour and texture are still enormously important for the House of Chanel today.
Out of the repeated legends that blossom around Chanel, one remains that she took the double C logo that came to emblemise her fashion house from the lampposts around Westminster.
She also started to design sporty clothes, you know, tennis clothes, equestrian clothes. I mean, that was something she got from the Duke of Westminster. She loved British equestrian clothes, because of course they were very tailored. Because Chanel was very intelligent, she was also a major cultural figure at that time, and she cultivated something of a salon. She was very friendly with Cocteau, she knew Picasso. She did costumes for Ballet Russe, and she designed the costumes for the stage adaptation of Maupassant's Belle Amie. She was a cultivated woman.
There was very much this idea that she was plugged into an art scene, and not only that she was a bystander, and not only that she was part of cafe society, but she was an active participant.
Chanel was admired and worn by numerous celebrities, including Grace Kelly, Princess Caroline, and Elizabeth Taylor.
Chanel had many signatures, so you'd wear your poor fisherman's jersey with, a diamond ring, but also why not chuck on a fake pearl necklace as well, and make it a really big, long necklace that you twist around your neck lots of times, because that looks much more fabulous than some polite little real pearl necklace. If you haven't got it, you can still flaunt it, but you get fakes, good fakes.
Of course, some of her iconic garments from those early years were the striped sailor shirt, and then, of course, the famous Chanel suit. You could wear your suit and you could go right through from the day through into the evening.
By the 30s, she'd done this little black dress, and that was revolutionary, because prior to that, black was definitely the colour of mourning. You did not wear it.
Vogue called it the Ford, the equivalent of Henry Ford's motor car. They wrote that 10 out of 10 women had one, 10 out of 10 women wanted one, and that this really would be the dress of the future, if you like. And they were right.
Chanel said that she didn't need to use other colours because black had it all. And I really think for Chanel, this idea of black ties in with these notions of practicality, with these notions of modernity, and also with an idea of shocking people. The idea of dressing somebody in black in the 1920s was a shocking notion.
The co-respondent shoe, we can't forget that. That was based on men's shoes, the beigey shoe with the little black tip. Chanel knew that nude shoe made your leg look longer, but she wanted to make it really smart, give it a bit of punch, so she put the black tips on it. Of course, the other thing that she invented was the 2.5 bag, named because it was invented in February 1955. What a brilliant bag. I mean, it's something that women still aspire to, and it's the same design.
I think really when you think about Chanel's style, it's this whole idea of form following function, ornament being crime. All these different ideas are coming together. It's the ideas that are influencing across the entirety of European culture, but in fashion they're best represented by Chanel.
In 1924, Chanel took a bold step with the creation of Parfum Chanel.
Designer perfume had existed previously. The couturier Paul Poiret had founded Parfum Rosine, but he'd never lent his name to a perfume. In 1924, Chanel founded Parfum Chanel and launched her first fragrance, which was called Chanel No. 5.
She was very superstitious, Chanel, so number 5 was her lucky number. She chose the mix of the perfumes herself with her nose. It has jasmine in it, amongst other, lots of different notes in it, rose, all the things that she personally loved. This was not a designer going and picking something off the shelf and saying, that'll do, we'll do another one in 15 months' time. This was a perfume that she wore. It was the perfume that she wore.
The bottle itself was based, Chanel said, on a variety of different themes. On the one hand, the stopper was supposedly based on the shape of the Place Vendôme. It was also inspired by the gentlemen's toilet sets of her different suitors, as well as by the kind of chemical bottles that she would see at work in the laboratory when they were actually mixing the potion.
And of course, Chanel No. 5 would get what's possibly the most famous unsolicited celebrity endorsement of all time, when Marilyn Monroe was asked in an interview what she wore in bed and said 5 drops of Chanel No. 5. Of course, The Second World War cut an absolute swathe across the Paris fashion industry. How not? And every designer had to make their own response. But Coco Chanel's response would cause a great deal of controversy. She became romantically involved with a leading German, Gunther von Dinklage, and it was he who enabled her still to go on living in her apartment in Paris in the Ritz.
She actually denounced the owners of Parfum Chanel, the Werthemeyers, as Jews and tries to get control of the company.
That really was her undoing, because they were very, very tough on collaborators, or should I say collaboratrices, because of course it was the women who bore the brunt of it. You know, they would feather and tar the heads of women who had affairs, and Chanel was very lucky to escape that. I mean, she escaped that because she did escape. She went to live in Switzerland. There is one theory in one of the many books written about her that she was sort of spying for Churchill, because through the Duke of Westminster she had met Churchill, not just met him, but she had become friendly with him. There is this theory that Chanel was an incredibly useful and effective spy. I do not know if there is any merit in this theory. Who knows?
Her known collaboration with the Nazis did profoundly affect her reputation. After the war, the French never quite forgave Chanel for really quite some time. She tried to play it down herself. As the Americans liberated Paris, Chanel ordered her staff to give out free Chanel No. 5 perfume to the American GIs so they could take a little glamour home. And that made her very popular with the Americans who were around then, but the French were a lot slower to forgive her.
Chanel was actually brought back into fashion because sales of Chanel No. 5 had gone on the wane. So the owners of Parfum Chanel approached her with a deal, which was that they would cover her living expenses, whatever they were, for the rest of her life, if she would come back and start to make fashion collections again. Chanel presented her comeback collection for spring 1954, and although the collection was well received, particularly by the American press, the French were aghast. They felt that Chanel was out of touch with the times.
Chanel herself said that she wanted to make an answer to the ludicrousness of Dior's upholstered, as she called them, clothes, and that in a sense is why she'd come back out of retirement.
She launched at that point the cardigan suit, which replaced the structure of tailoring like Dior's with soft quilting to hold layers of tweed against layers of silk. The base of the jacket was weighted with a chain to allow it to hang straight, and that really influenced women's fashion across all different levels. It became the way that women dressed. Women of a certain age and a certain class for the next 50 years.
Coco Chanel died on January the 10th, 1971.
So Chanel died in 1971. So she had gone from the Victorian era into the modern era.
I think the legacy of Coco Chanel is enormous. We almost can't calculate her importance because effectively we are all still wearing Chanel designs today.
The stripy t-shirts, the little black dress, just as popular now, if not more so. The suit, the slouchy cardigan jacket.
Clothes that you can move in, work in, clothes that just don't constrain the body.
For me, she is the 20th century designer because we really are still wearing so much of what she did now.
After Chanel's death in 1971, the House of Chanel ticked along for some years, but what really revolutionised it was in 1983 when Karl Lagerfeld came to the helm.
When Lagerfeld was brought into Chanel, the whole idea was for him to energise Chanel. Chanel has been said at that point to have been like Tutankhamun's tomb, not meaning kind of a place of undiscovered treasures, but something that was really dusty and really old. And what Lagerfeld did in '83 was to start to dust it off and to reignite Chanel's legacy, to reanimate Chanel. It was about how do you make this moribund thing fashionable. How do you make people forget their grandmother wearing a Chanel suit and want to wear one themselves? And that's really was the challenge that was placed with Lagerfeld.
What he very cleverly did was identify what they now call codes, but are the signature pieces, you know, the little black dress, the suit, the tweeds, the correspondence shoes. And he has reworked them endlessly for the last 40 years and, you know, often made them ridiculous, deliberately.
It was really about an irreverence, but what Lagerfeld did at Chanel was set the blueprint for designer house revivals, which is still with us today.
Karl Lagerfeld really has taken the house of Chanel onwards and upwards and outwards and made it a real commercial powerhouse.
I mean, I think the interesting thing with Chanel is that in this world of fashion that's incredibly open and incredibly boastful about its financial figures and about how well everything's doing and about how well everything's selling, Chanel's privately owned, and Chanel is the one that no one really knows anything about. No one knows how well Chanel is doing. The only thing we know is that Chanel is able to stage these kind of spectacular events. We know that Chanel is able to make these kind of incredible clothes.
I think of all the labels, Chanel somehow has never lost its sort of classiness, and I think that's a combination of very clever business manoeuvring and marketing from the Wertheimers. But I think it's also got to do with the aura of Coco Chanel. She's just this incredible woman. She is the most powerful weapon that Chanel has.
Well, there's no way Chanel will ever die. It can't. Chanel's it's the most famous house in fashion. It's always going to survive. Although the flesh may wither, the name will still prevail. The Chanel name will always continue because Chanel's actually more than fashion, Chanel's style. There's something eternal about it. It will always continue.